Factorio Space Age dropped a couple of weeks ago, and there's never been a better time to get into one of the most addictive games of all time, so here are my 12 tips for new players. First of all, don't be afraid to turn off enemies. When creating your game, you can tweak a huge number of options. These mostly change the spawn rates of all the different kinds of resources in-game, and for the most part you can leave this on default and have a good time. However, one setting you might want to change is whether enemies spawn or not. By default, enemy bases are spread throughout the map, and once your base kicks out enough pollution, they'll come running over to tear it to pieces. As long as you're prepared and continue to fortify your base, this isn't really a problem, but when you're just learning the game, it can be a lot to manage, especially if you're not expecting it. I'd recommend turning them off, or at least turning on peaceful until you're a bit more comfortable with the game, as it allows you to really take your time and understand how to progress without having to worry about constantly building out turrets, walls, and ammo supplies. In my opinion, the game doesn't really need enemies, since the focus is really on the building and the automation, but if you play around and decide you want more challenge, feel free to turn them on later. Another thing you should do before loading into your game is to preview your map. You can do this by clicking the preview button, and it will load a chunk of the map so you can check it out before moving in. You'll spawn pretty much at the center of the preview, so you want to make sure you have ample resources to get started. You're looking for iron, copper, coal, and stone all relatively nearby to each other, as well as some water. Every map is absolutely playable, but if you get one like I just described, you'll have a much easier and quicker early game before you can get to the good stuff. If resources are too far away, your progress will be super slow and you'll probably get bored of walking around for minutes at a time between your different resources. Factorio can be a very slow game to start off with, so making that slow part as fast and painless as possible will massively help you to have fun and get to the good bits. Once you're in-game, you can of course get playing, but there's a couple of useful keybinds and options that'll help you out as you go. If you hold shift when trying to place an item, you'll instead place a ghost. This lets you plan out where you want things to go without needing the resources or having to pick them up when you make a mistake. Early on, this won't be all that useful, but later on for larger projects, it's a must to plan things out without the risk of having to pick up 300 items one by one because you need to move them one tile to the left. Pressing Alt will enable the aptly named Alt mode. This shows what's being made inside of each machine and what's stored in each chest. This is extremely useful when looking at larger parts of the factory, so you know what's being made and where, if you need to collect some resources or simply plan out an expansion. Control clicking on something with an empty hand will take whatever products are inside into your inventory. Control clicking with something in your hand, if applicable, will deposit them into the building. Both of these are very useful early on when you're moving resources manually, especially for coal. Shift right-clicking on an assembler will copy the recipe it's set and allow you to paste it by left-clicking onto other assemblers. This saves you having to set each one manually if you want multiple assemblers making the same thing. Pressing Q whilst you're hovering over something will put the item in your hand if you have it in your inventory, otherwise it'll simply select a ghost. Lastly, there's even Control Z, and this will blueprint out your last few changes, so try not to rely on this too much as you still have to manually do it, but it can be useful if you've done something wrong and want to know how to undo it. The toolbar in Factorio works a little differently to something like Minecraft, where instead of placing items you already own, you instead assign any item to a slot, and regardless of inventory, it will stay in that slot. You also have the option to switch between various different toolbars, and this is incredibly useful for different areas of the factory. You can make one toolbar that's entirely military focused with turrets and walls and grenades, or one that's for assembly lines with assemblers, inserters, and various belts. I very much encourage you to make each toolbar dedicated to a certain job or area of the factory and switch between them regularly to make building as easy as possible. It can be a little bit overwhelming and you'll likely repeat items here and there, but it all helps make building a lot simpler without having to go back and forth to the inventory. In the early game, setting up your first bits of automation will be one of the first hurdles you come to when starting a new game. You'll load into the world with a single burner mining drill and a furnace and have to figure it out from there. I'd advise immediately putting that miner to work on an iron ore patch and feed it directly to the furnace. Both will need some coal to get to work, but this will get you a steady source of iron which you can then use to set up the same on copper and 2 drills on coal. These two can feed directly into each other to keep both fueled up and working, allowing you to control click to collect coal whenever it's needed for other machines. This very basic setup means you don't have to manually be mining too much, which is great since that gets boring real fast. Beyond this, you'll want to set up some sort of coal delivery system to your first boiler to keep up your early electricity, expand both mining and smelting to now rely on electricity, and eventually set up some assemblers to automatically create signs. I could go on forever since that's kind of the point of the entire game, but the bottom line is set up automation as early as you can and as safely as you can. Not only will this save you time, but in my opinion, it makes the game a lot more fun as you can focus on building and the big picture of your factory rather than standing still waiting for items to be crafted. This next tip is really quick and may seem obvious, but I guarantee someone won't know this. All belts in game have 2 sides to them and each side has to be filled up individually. If you simply have all of your inserters on one side, they'll only feed onto one side of the belt, leaving the other side totally empty and potentially harming your efficiency. Instead, you'll want to balance both sides if you want to use them to their full capacity, or simply use a splitter to balance both sides equally, no matter what the input is. Sometimes the one side can work for you if you have certain recipes that require more than one type of material, and by putting these on either side of a single belt, you can supply all items in one, rather than having to double up on your belts and assemblers. And if you want to know how many items a belt can carry per side, then look no further than the Factorio cheat sheet. This page on the internet superhighway not only tells you how many items per second each tier of belt can support per side, it also contains ratios for just about anything you could need in game and is regularly being updated, so is a pretty reliable resource. If you want to know how many miners you need to totally fill up a belt or how many furnaces to totally empty it, then this has you covered. If you have a second screen whilst playing, I highly recommend having this on it at all times as it saves you so much maths. It doesn't tell you how to build maximum efficiency layouts, so it's not really taking the fun out of the game and is instead just giving you the requirements to go out and build it for yourself. There's a ton more information on this page if you want to get into the details about various kinds of fuel efficiency, transfer speed, and so on, but you can use it at a surface level and be just fine, especially when getting started. The cheat sheet is also a great way to help you plan ahead. Let's say you want to set up a full belt of iron and copper. Well, you'll need 48 stone furnaces, so you can plan an area for a setup like this to go. However, I would not recommend building this entire setup in one go for a multitude of reasons. First of all, it's a colossal amount of resources, so it'll take you a very long time to manually craft everything. Secondly, what are the chances you'll even get close to using enough iron to use that full belt anytime soon, so there's really no point. All you'll end up with is a bunch of idle machines spitting out a bunch of pollution and potentially causing an alien attack before you're ready. And that brings me to my third point. If you make this giant setup and don't properly defend it, provided you have aliens enabled, it'll likely get partially damaged or destroyed before you can react. By all means, use ghost buildings to plan out where each new area of your factory will go, but don't bother building the full thing until you actually need it. Of course, you should leave some space to be able to transport resources around your factory so you don't end up with a sticky situation later. Planning ahead is just fine, but don't hard commit to anything until you're ready. Once you get to the point where you need full belts of resources, then you can work on supplying them. But until that point, just focus on slow, safe expansion. You'll have more fun and efficiency, so really just more fun times 2. Speaking of planning, blueprints are absolutely the best way to do this. If you make a setup that you're likely to use multiple times, like a full belt smelting setup, you should absolutely make a blueprint so you can easily copy it in future. Doing this is as simple as selecting the blueprint tool, dragging the box around everything you want to include, and that's it. You can remove parts in the blueprint menu, name each one, and even store them all in a book for easier inventory management. Later on, once you have robots that can do the building for you, this will come in even more useful, but even at the very start of your game, it's a great way to plan out your factory and manage space. Plus, you can import other people's blueprints if you need inspiration or help with a complicated production chain. I personally have been using Catherine of Sky's mole blueprints for years, which let you feed in raw resources and have access to almost any item you could need in a single area. She's a great factory game content creator who you should absolutely check out if you want to learn more about Factorio, and these blueprints have made my game so much easier. Importing is as easy as getting the blueprint's URL string and pasting it in the importer, and boom, it's ready to place. Just be warned that blueprints may break when the game gets updated, so keep an eye on anything that you build using older files to make sure it's working as intended. For example, that mole I mentioned, a couple of the assemblers don't do anything now because the assemblers they used to build don't exist anymore. Still, even if you want to figure everything out for yourself, blueprints are a great way to plan and quickly expand your factory. Speaking of expansion, if you're doing any amount of it and have enemies enabled, you'll want to fortify the area before you even think about building any factory parts. If you build your factory first and they attack, you won't be able to do much to fight them off without taking any damage, so plan out how much space you need and expand your borders and secure the area first. Defenses in-game are mainly various turrets and walls. Walls are easy, you just build them and they block enemies moving in. They can still take damage, so will need repairing after most attacks, but they slow enemies down enough for your turrets to take them out, so are well worth the effort. Turrets attack any enemies in their range, but most of them need some kind of ammo. I'd advise spreading turrets out so that the previous turret is about 3/4 of its range away, so you have good coverage of your entire wall. Then run a belt that loops all the way around your entire wall that you feed ammo to and place inserters on every turret. Obviously, the exact kind of ammo will vary over time, and your first wall will likely take some building, but once you have a system like this in place, you'll be a lot safer from enemy attacks. Just be aware that the strength and size of attacks will only ever increase over time, so doubling or even tripling up the thickness of your walls and employing the use of more advanced turrets and ammunition will be the way to go to stay safe all game long. You'll also likely come across enemy bases on your travels and may even need to take them out to expand your factory. These can take some serious work, so make sure you're extremely prepared and save beforehand, as they can very quickly go sideways if you're not adequately prepared. And if you're thinking the expansion will ever stop, you are sorely mistaken. The factory must always grow. Even if you build all the factory you want to build, resources like iron, copper, coal, and so on will run out eventually, meaning you'll need to collect them from further afield to stay afloat. You can see how many resources are in each patch of ore from the map view, and I'd advise keeping an eye on this so you know when they're running low. Once they run out, you'll want to already have the majority of the work in place to replace them, otherwise your factory and game can come to a very sudden standstill. I'd also advise building in buffers for your factory, and all this means is somewhere for excess resources to be stored when there is a deficit. In my ore smelters, I place a chest between each furnace and the main belt, and even though this does significantly increase the size, It also means when I run out of ore, I'll have some time to fix things before everything comes to a standstill. Just be aware that doing this tends to generate a lot more pollution than you would otherwise, but as long as you're defended, I think the trade-off is worth it. And lastly, to get resources from further away to your base, whilst you can technically use very long belts, I'd instead advise using trains, and this is for a number of reasons. First of all, look at those things. They're cool. Who doesn't love a train set? Secondly, they're a lot faster than even the fastest belts, meaning your resources get to your base quicker once everything is up and running. Thirdly, they act as a built-in buffer as they load up ore in bulk and drop it off in bulk, meaning you'll never be left with much of a bottleneck at either end. And lastly, they are far more efficient resource-wise than belts, with rails being far cheaper to make in bulk. Later on with signals, they do get pretty tricky, but once you get your head around it, they're pretty easy to set up and gather all the resources you could ever need. And those are my 12 tips to get you started in Factorio. Of course, there are hundreds more things to learn about the game, but everything here should be plenty to get you started with your very first factory. Like, subscribe, become a member to see yourself in the credits, and if you want more Factorio content, then check out this playlist with some of my beginner's guides. They're a little bit old, but they still mostly stand up today.